Hi folks, it's Dr. DiBiase and we're going to do our week one review. So in this video, I'm going to cover just very briefly uh, responses to some of the most common muddiest point questions that got raised this week across my various sections. So the top three questions that sort of came up were about extra labor, about Blackboard, and about transfer. So we're going to run through those right now. Well, actually start with Blackboard because it's sort of the most immediate issue that we need to address. So a couple people talked about how they had some difficulty finding where things were due or when things were due or how to submit them. I will be the first to admit that Blackboard is not a perfect system, but there really is no perfect system, whether you used Canvas or Google Classroom or Moodle. All of these systems have things that they do really well, and all of them have certain limitations. So let me show you some of the things that I think can help you streamline your Blackboard experience. So the first thing to note here is when you go to the home page on Blackboard and you look at the to-do list, right, that will give you a sense of, what you may have forgotten to do in the past due column, but also all of the important due dates for the week. So for example, tomorrow there's a chapter 2 assignment. The week gives you sort of a breakdown of your entire week. There are two issues with the to-do list, though, that you should be aware of. So the first is that if there is a quiz at the start of the week, as there will be basically every week, the other dates will not open up until you finish that quiz. And this is actually something that I've just sort of figured out. So for example, until you completed the week one review quiz, you wouldn't have been able to see the other deadlines. So the first thing you should do every week is just take that quick 5-question review quiz so that you can see all of your deadlines in Blackboard. Now, of course, if you go to the module map that will be in every weekly module, you'll have a breakdown of what's going on, but it's nice to sort of see the Blackboard deadlines. There is one big exception though. So the first one was the fact that if you hadn't taken the quiz yet, you can't see all of the deadlines. But the other is the weekly muddiest point posts. I have yet to find an elegant way to make the deadline for those postings show up on the homepage. There are a couple ways to do it, but they're really inelegant and actually make things a little bit more confusing than they need to be. So you just need to remember that before our Friday meeting, you need to make sure you submit your muddiest point. And in fact, the thread for this week is already up. So if you've encountered something that you'd like to ask a question about, you could already start posting that. In terms of extra labor, I have not told you the specifics of the extra labor assignments because they aren't really relevant yet. But what I'm going to do really quickly is give you a breakdown of some examples of the kinds of assignments that you might encounter. So for example, I might ask you to provide additional peer feedback for your group. So instead of putting together like a 500-word response to one member of your group, you might have to put together a 500-word response to all 3 or all 4 members of your group. And so you're doing work that benefits the entire group, and as such, that extra labor will raise your grade from a B to a B plus, or wherever it is, up 1/3 of a grade step. You might choose to do something called a collaborative reflection, and this is where you get together with 1 or 2 or your entire group, right, to talk about and think about your experience of completing some portion of a project, right? And what worked, what didn't work. And I have specific prompts for you to think about. So for example, you might do one of these after the first podcast project is due, and your group can go back and reflect on like what worked about that podcast, what didn't work about, how will we change our approach for the ones that are coming up throughout the semester. And so by thinking about that kind of material and talking about it, you are benefiting the larger group that you are a part of. A third option that you might encounter this semester is something called an application demonstration, and this is where you take one of the central course concepts and put together some kind of content that demonstrates what it would be like to apply that concept to a real world example. So here's an example that you might do, and I might set this up early in maybe like week 4, week 5. I might post a final version of a lecture, and I might post like the first draft of that lecture, right? So I'll post 2 lecture recordings, and then your job will be to use the concepts in chapter 2 tied to rhetorical reading to analyze those two videos and talk about why I might have made the changes that I made, right? So you look at the rough draft, you look at the final draft, you look at some of the concepts from chapter 2 and say, okay, based on these concepts, this might explain, or here's how I'm going to explain why Dr. DiBiase revised this particular video in the way that he did. Finally, I say finally, there might be other options, but this is the fourth one for now. A project resource, building a project resource. So you have some major projects throughout the semester. You might have the opportunity to build resources for your team, right? For your group, so that they are able to work more effectively on the project. So an example of this would be that as part of the major project, you are going to put together an annotated bibliography. Each member of the group will be responsible for generating a certain number of annotated bibliography entries. As a way to conduct some extra labor, you might contribute additional resources to that annotated bibliography, right? You might be responsible for reading and reviewing a larger number of sources for the project. And all of these are kinds of labor that not just benefit you as a learner, but benefit the group as a whole. Finally, I want to wrap up with a quick discussion of transfer. There were a lot of questions about near versus far transfer, about low road, high road, and how these tie together. So first, it's important to note here, right, that these are two different frameworks, right? And I actually don't think that the textbook makes that clear enough. These are simply two different ways of thinking about the concept of transfer, right? Transfer being how we use learning that we have developed in one context and make use of it in another context, right? So how has our experiences as writers in one situation, how does that help us navigate a new situation? So we've got near versus far and low road versus high road. And although those often go together, they are two distinct frameworks that are looking at two different kinds of questions. So when we're talking about near versus far, we're really just trying to keep in mind how similar are the two tasks that we're talking about. So how similar is the new task to tasks that we've done before? So here are some concrete examples. If you've ever done a high school chemistry lab report or any high school science lab report, right, then you've had some good amount of experience in putting together a lab report with like a hypothesis and materials and discussion and procedures and blah, 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 and conclusions, right? Well, in theory, if you're then asked to do a lab report for a chemistry class in college, there should be at least some significant overlap in what that kind of document calls for. And so you can draw pretty clearly from those previous experiences in working in this new format or for this new genre or this new writing task or situation. Similarly, if you ever send an email to your high school teachers, right, there probably isn't a whole lot of difference between doing that and emailing your college professor. Now, it's obviously going to differ from professor to professor, but for the most part, your experience in doing one kind of writing is very similar to the new kind of writing that you are encountering. And so we would say that that is an example of near transfer, right? The work that you're doing is very, very similar to work that you've done before, and so you can draw from what you know more effectively. Far transfer is when the new task is really not similar to anything you've done before. So for example, you might have collaboratively written an essay, but you may never have collaboratively produced a podcast, right? Or you may have listened to a podcast, but you've never made a podcast, right? And so the new task that you're being called to do is significantly different from other kinds of tasks that you've been directly involved with. Similarly, if we think about, you might have had to write about a place for a class, right? Maybe reflect upon where you come from, or if you're taking a science class, talk about a particular location, right? There are lots of different reasons why you might write about a place. But that's different than having to create an audio tour, right, of a college. So there might be like some things you can draw from, but the reality is that this new genre, right, this new form of writing, this new situation that you're encountering is far removed from the work that you have done previously. And so you, in a metaphorical sense, have to go a greater distance in order to accomplish that kind of task. So again, when we're talking about near versus far, all we really care about is how similar are the two tasks that we are comparing. When we're talking about low road versus high road, we're really talking about how automatic is the process of moving from one idea to another. So I'm using the same examples here, but I'm talking about it in a different sort of way, right? low road and near transfer have a lot of overlap because in a low road situation, you don't have to think that hard about how to translate your previous experience to your new experience. Now, actually, the email one is probably one of the better examples here, right? You probably don't spend a lot of time, or you probably haven't spent a lot of time before emailing a professor saying, how is this different from when I've emailed other teachers in the past, right? Like, you probably just sat down and wrote the email. So there's sort of an automaticity to it. And if we can see that kind of automaticity, then we can be fairly clear that we're dealing with an example of what we'll call, again, low road transfer. Similarly, with high school chem lab versus a college chem lab, like you probably, if you've done enough lab reports, know what a hypothesis is. You know what procedures are. You know what results are, right? You have a lot of knowledge and you can apply it in a pretty much one-to-one correlation for this new task. So you don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about, well, how does a hypothesis in this particular context differ from a hypothesis in this other new context? And even if you did, it probably isn't that much of a stretch. And so again, there tends to be a lot of overload, or I should say overlap, in low road and near transfer situations. When we think about high road, again, we're talking about how automatic is the process. Well, I would argue that the movement from writing a collaborative essay to collaboratively producing a podcast is not particularly automatic. There's a lot of things you need to know or learn in order to do this new task that you may not already know or learn. And so you can't do it automatically. You need to spend time thinking about not only what do I need to learn and then learn that stuff, you then need to think about how do I apply what I've just learned and how do I combine that with stuff I already know in order to produce this new kind of product. Similarly, even if you are doing a tour about a place that you're very familiar with, you're still going to have to think about what does a tour sound like? What are the qualities of a good tour? How do you organize a tour in a way that makes sense both in terms of, thematic issues, accessibility issues, actually like walking the tour kinds of issues. Um, and so you can't just like automatically jump from one to the other. You have to spend more time kind of thinking about how is this distinct from what we're doing. And again, there's a lot of overlap between high road and far transfer, right? The further something is from what you have done before, the more, in theory, if you're trying to be successful, you need to think critically about what you need to learn, how the situation is different, how you synthesize what you already know with what you're going to be learning in order to produce this kind of project. Now, is it possible to have like high road, or I should say low road and far transfer? It is, but they tend to go poorly. So that's like a situation where a student assumes that two things are really close together, or a learner assumes that two things are very similar, when in fact they are not. So this would be like if a professor asks you for a research paper that makes an argument, and you produce one that just makes summaries, right? Or just provides summaries because maybe that's what you did in high school. Or a place where students really get tripped up is like how do you use sources, right? So in high school, they're frequently using sources to just like support what they already know, and so they just very carefully pick the sources out that already support the argument that they're making. But in a college context, sources have to do something different, and we'll talk more about that throughout the course. But we're looking at sources not, and they actually talk about this in chapter 2. We're not just looking at sources to like prove what we already know. We look at sources so we can learn more about the topic and figure out what we want to argue in the first place. So when students assume that these two things are similar, when they are in fact more further removed than they assumed, then what we end up having is sort of an unsuccessful case of transfer, sort of a failed transfer experience. But again, I don't want this to be, I'll back up a second here, right? I don't want you to have to overthink this. In its simplest terms, again, near versus far is simply how similar are the two things that we're comparing. How similar is the old situation to the new situation? And then when we're looking at low road versus high road, which again maps on relatively neatly to near versus far, it's a question of how much does the writer have to consciously think about the decisions that he, she, or they are making as they move from the old situation to the new situation. The more you have to sort of pause and reflect and think about the actual choices that you're making, the more that we're in a case of a high road transfer situation. And in situations where you just sort of jump in and do the thing, right, because you already have done similar things enough times to feel like you've got this, right, then we're really dealing with a low road situation. For our purposes, right, this is just a way of thinking about how we're going to apply different kinds of concepts throughout the semester, right? Or thinking about, I'll be asking you to think about how can you draw from like what you've done before uh, to help you with what we're doing now. As we get to the end of the course, when we start thinking about transfer at the end of the semester, we'll start thinking about how can you take what you've learned in this course and begin applying it to other courses or other kinds of situations that you might encounter outside of the classroom. So I hope this answered some of your questions. Again, you can check out your Muddiest Point posts, where I try to be a little bit more specific where I could be. But if you still have questions, feel free to shoot me an email, post in the general discussion board, or grab me during office hours, and I would be happy to elaborate on any of these topics further. Hope everyone's having a good week. Take care.